Hello dear colleagues from the Festival of Lithics. I'm glad to be here presenting our work. My name is João Carlos Moreno de Sousa. This work is also a work from Moreno de Sousa Okumura. We are both from the Laboratory for Human Evolutionary Studies from the Institute of Biosciences, University of São Paulo, Brazil. Glad to be here to present a study case in which we applied a new technological protocol for the study of lithic points. First, we need to give a context on the study case that we are applying this protocol. According to Brazilian archaeological literature, there were only two different American cultures in eastern South America. One located more to the north, specifically in the northeastern Brazil and midwestern Brazil, and the other one more to the south, occupying all southeastern and southern Brazil, but also all Uruguay and some adjacent areas of Argentina and Paraguay. To the north, that will be the Itaparica tradition. To the south, that will be the UMBU tradition. Most recently, in our studies, we also defined the Lagoa Santense culture in southeastern Brazil, presenting a lithic industry that is not related to both Itaparica or UMBU. But since our work is not related to the Lagoa Santense industry this time, I'm going to focus more on the other two cultures that were previously defined. The tradition was first defined by Pedro Ignacio Schmitz in the 80s. It was supposed to be an industry that has 14,000 years until 7,000 years ago. Main features of this industry is the lack of points or bifacial technologies of any type, but there's a frequent presence of lismas. Lisma is a type of artifact that sometimes can be very similar to the limace from the Paleolithic in Eurasia, but it's not a limace. Functional scraper that has a large flake as a blank. It's made by unifacial reduction, and there are many other attributes that are very standardized. On the other side, the UMBU tradition has similar dates, 13.5 thousand years ago, old sites, and it's supposed to have an occupation that goes until 200 years ago. Although it is known as an archaeological tradition for many decades, originally it was defined as an archaeological phase by Eurico Miller from the 60s to the 70s. In fact, many authors attempted to define different types, traditions, and phases in southeastern and southern Brazil during this time. All the sites were presenting types of points. However, due to the lack of standardized protocols to compare these types, everything in the 80s was started to be reclassified everything as UMBU tradition. So the main definition for the UMBU tradition was the presence of projectile points. With projectile, they actually mean stemmed points. There were no other specification on how to identify a UMBU tradition site. Of course, many criticisms started to appear because of that. The 90s, the 2000 years, the 2010 years are marked by many critics on the UMBU tradition definition. Most of these critics were related to the lack of technological analysis and comparison between these points, since all of these industries were supposed to be culturally homogeneous. However, for both Itaparica and UMBU tradition, there were many studies that were actually contradicting the idea of an Itaparica tradition or the idea of the UMBU tradition. And specifically in the case of Brazilian archaeology, no technological analysis comparing different point types was ever made. This is not the case in Uruguay, for example. While Soares, for instance, Uruguayan archaeologists, compare points in northern Uruguay, find at least 3 different industries, corroborating the fell type points and the Tigre tradition type points. And he also defined a new type, the Pei Passo point. It's also important to be said that no archaeologist outside of Brazil ever used the term UMBU tradition or ever accepted this model. Also, many of the criticism against the UMBU tradition said that the Tigre tradition was actually the same UMBU tradition, except that it was in the other side of the border. In Brazil it's supposed to be UMBU, and in Uruguay it was supposed to be Tigre, since the Tigre tradition was also having some issues in its definition. Anyway, according to the UMBU tradition model, all PALEOAMERICAN lithic assemblages presenting stemmed points in eastern South America were supposed to be culturally homogeneous. That some studies were contradicting this idea. Well, we noticed that shapes are actually heterogeneous, and there is no UMBU outside Brazil. So, is the technology at least homogeneous? This is our study case. We analyzed points from 4 sites with absolute chronology. Many more sites are being studied right now and dated, but due to COVID-19, all research in museums is on hold. So this is what we have to present during this time. We studied the Caetetuba site in São Paulo state, with dates of 11,000 to 8,000 years ago. We have the Alicibuar site, also in São Paulo state, with dates from 8.5 thousand to 7,000 years ago. We have the Tuna site in Paraná state, with 11.5 to 8,000 years ago. And finally, the Garibaldino site in Rio Grande do Sul state, with 11.5 years ago, with an occupation until the late Holocene, with no absolute date for this most recent occupation. But as you can see, all these sites present different morphologies on the lithic points. The protocol that we proposed has been recently published in Quaternary International, and you're all welcome to take a look in our article. But what I can explain in a short version is that we analyzed 500 points from these 3 different regions. We analyzed 31 attributes, metric, morphological, and technological attributes, including the diachrony, allowed us to apply many statistics. For all metric, morphological, and technological analysis, we have schemes explaining how to analyze, identify, and classify each shape, each technical type. And the ones that you are seeing in the slide are not the only ones, there are more, as you can see in the article. Basically, in this protocol, we create an Excel sheet where we put all the data that we are observing, which allow us to apply all the statistics, and in the end, we will have basically something like this. Each line represents an attribute of the points, and each column represents a different type of point that has been identified in this statistical analysis by comparison all attributes, and it will tell us how significantly different are those assemblages. With this, we are also able to make representations, schemes, that tell us how these points are produced. In this slide, we're showing, for example, the Rio Clarense type points, which have all the same shape, but you can make them in 2 different ways. As previously seen in the table, we actually found 5 different types of points, although a same type of point can have diversity on technological terms or morphological terms. But this diversity is so small between the same type that they are still defined as the same type. What we can also identify is that these types are in different regions of Eastern South America. To know more about these regional differences, I invite you to read this book chapter that has been also recently published. It summarizes all the lithic industries from PALEOAMERICAN context in Eastern South America. The results of this protocol are also corroborated by an experimental archaeology that has also been recently published in the XR journal. In experiments, we have made the use of analog percussion and pressure flickers, like pebbles and deer antlers. And we also use the same raw materials collected on the same PALEOAMERICAN sources. And we have the success to replicate perfectly the technology and morphology of these points, as well as the lesmas, which, by the way, are also present in the Rio Clarense industry, together with the points, which goes against the idea of UMBU and Itaparica tradition, as previously said. Our main conclusions: although we identify a small diversity on the technology of some point types, for instance, we notice that morphology plays a more important role in the distinction of the PALEOAMERICAN industries in meridional Brazil. It does not mean that technology is not important in this classification, since its diversity is very limited. The UMBU tradition sites are not homogeneous at all. Further publications on the complete assemblage, not just the points, will be available soon. However, UMBU tradition is still not valid model to explain all the stone tool diversity observed in sites from southeastern and southern Brazil. And this term, UMBU, carries a history of definition problems in Brazilian archaeology. It might be better to avoid calling anything UMBU again. Our proposal is to looking for technological patterns in lithic assemblages previously associated to the UMBU tradition in order to define lithic industries in a proper way. First step we took to that is verifying if previous definitions of point times are valid in technological terms. For example, Tom Miller Jr. between the 60s and 70s defined the Rio Claro tradition that we are actually calling Rio Clarense tradition. And currently, this is not published yet, but currently in our research, we're starting to see that some of those previous definitions are actually making sense. And our technological analysis is corroborating these previous definitions before everything went defined as UMBU. As well, we are defining new types that we are identifying in our research. In general, our method allowed us to present new data on the technological features that helped us to further explore and propose new lithic point typologies. This study demonstrates not only the importance of the technological approach applied to the analysis of lithic industries, but also propose an adequate protocol for analyzing the main cultural attributes of lithic points, allowing researchers to better understand the cultural diversity of hunter-gatherer groups, especially when they are hiding under unsystematic classifications. The proposed protocol presents a series of attributes that can be observed in lithic points found in any context, allowing the data to be comparable to any other data analyzed under the same protocol, and using the same terminology for attributes and variables. However, the application of such protocol on different archaeological contexts may reveal that the categories for technological and morphological attributes proposed in this article are not enough to characterize and describe other point assemblages. In this sense, researchers need to suggest new categories for each attribute in the protocol if they are feasible to be identified in further studies. Our protocol presents great potential to be applied in new assemblages in order to better understand the cultural diversity of human groups that occupy the American continent since the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our work, and also thanks for the agencies that funded this research, CAPES and FAPESP. If you have any questions or if you have interest in more research, please contact us in the email that you can see there. Thank you very much.